Hello, everyone. So we're continuing Module 30, which is quite lengthy, and I think this is where I left off with Part A. So this is Part B. We started to talk about urban sprawl, and basically this is one example of a positive feedback loop. So remember, we're going to be over here where the population starts to shift to the suburbs for various reasons. We're going to see tax revenues decline. Because of this, less money will be able to operate and maintain public services that could have and should have been offered by the city itself. And then as services decline, we might see, crime even increase in the areas. And then from there, neighborhoods will decline, and then people will start to move away, which brings us back here, which then continues this vicious cycle called urban sprawl. The Highway Trust Fund is a U.S. federal fund that pays for the construction and maintenance of roads and highways. And the reason that this is mentioned, the Highway Trust Fund was begun by the Highway Revenue Act of 1956 and is funded by a federal gasoline tax, which pays for construction and maintenance of roads and highways. Anywho, we already know that people will tend to move away from urban areas for reasons such as land, larger home, cheaper home prices, and so on. But because of the roads that were needed or are needed on a continual basis, we have the Highway Trust Fund that helps to pay for those roads. So then what that leads to is this phenomenon known as induced demand, which is an increase in the supply of a good will cause demand to grow. So the increase in the supply of a good would be, in this example, good roads and highways that are leading from the suburbs to the urban areas. And if you're fostering this maintenance and quality of roads, then you're going to expect more people to use those roads and possibly leave the urban areas and move out to the suburban areas. So induced demand is also a positive feedback loop in that the more that goods are provided away from the urban area, then we could expect more people to move there. An example would be, let's say we have more gas being used because people are commuting to and from the suburbs. And so more gas is used, that's going to possibly increase a gasoline tax added to gas by states, and that's going to increase revenue. Because it increased revenue, more roads and better roads are built, and the suburbs begin to expand because there's demand there for more homes. What that's going to do is increase possible traffic congestion, which is going to lead to longer commutes, which would then lead to greater gas being used. And again, the entire cycle is perpetuating itself. It's a positive feedback loop. So that's what I just described here in this diagram. Going back to this, there's such thing known as zoning, and this is something that's established by counties, and it's a planning tool that's used to separate industrial areas from businesses and residential neighborhoods for a number of reasons. You would want to separate, let's say, an oil refinery from residential neighborhoods because, let's say an oil refinery, you don't want that in your backyard necessarily. And unfortunately, even with zoning in place, there are areas of our county, Contra Costa County, I'm thinking of Richmond in particular, where there may be zoning, but people actually do have a refinery right in their backyard. And so while these tools are used to separate industry and business, sometimes there's still overlap. And unfortunately, the people of Richmond, California, they have had to endure a lot of pollution shelter-in-place events because those oil refineries are right in their backyard. Martinez is another good example. Oil refineries there, Martinez has had to shelter in place and experience pollution events a number of times over the last several decades. Multi-use zoning is another planning tool, and this is a zoning classification that allows retail and high density residential development to exist in the same area. So this would be mixed use planning, which is a good idea because then in many ways you're able to overlap a lot of land use. We're starting to see multi-use zoning used a lot in Walnut Creek. Right down the street here next to Pleasant Hill BART station, there are several multi-use buildings there. So you can go to restaurants on the first floor, but then when you go to the second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth floor, you will find residences in place. And so it encourages such things as, walkability, community, good use of land. So you're using less of a footprint to solve more land use approaches. And so multi-use zoning has become extremely popular in the recent years. This leads to the idea of smart growth, which is a set of principles for community planning. And these are going to be strategies that encourage the development of sustainable, healthy communities. And so the multi-use zoning was a good example of number one here, which is creating mixed land uses. You want to be able to create a range of housing opportunities and choices so that you don't have, the wealthy completely separated from the poor. A good example of that would be urban blight. As wealthier individuals decide to leave urban areas, well, then you can just see how the socioeconomic status of those that are more less wealthy would have an even greater or more difficult time being able to thrive and exist in those areas. So creating a range of housing opportunities and choices is very important. I know that in the city of Clayton, most recently with our voting, that was a huge part of the city council candidates' platforms, is that they were delicately suggesting that there needs to be a balance in the city of Clayton because there's a lot of residents who do not want any kind of housing that's going to necessarily increase lower socioeconomic status individuals in living there. And so they're really out to protect their property taxes and what their property taxes pay for. It can be quite contentious when talking it through. You want to be able to create walkable neighborhoods for aesthetic purposes, and you want to encourage community and stakeholder collaboration in development decisions, which actually goes back to the city of Clayton example. That was part of their platforms also, was that they felt that they really needed to listen to the residents of Clayton when making these big decisions. So a stakeholder, you guys should know, is any person or organization that has an interest in a particular place or issue. For example, here you are a stakeholder of Carondelet, and you have vested interest in the quality of education that you receive. Right now during COVID, you're a stakeholder and you have a vested interest in the health practices and policies that we have in place to protect you. So again, those are just some examples of what a stakeholder could be. Another smart growth idea is to take advantage of compact building design. So as I mentioned, down the street here, we have some buildings next to Pleasant Hill BART where the footprint is smaller because they've put restaurants and other shops on the first level, and then you build your residences on top. And so it allows for a more compact building design. You want to foster distinctive, attractive communities with a strong sense of place. Again, you want to be able to retain your citizens. If you don't have an attractive community, then people are going to start to look elsewhere. And so you want to foster that sense of place and belonging and community so that people will want to remain in that community. Sense of place, I just mentioned that. So something like having meaningful character. I think Walnut Creek does a nice job of meaningful character. I'm thinking of cities like Portland, a lot of character. it's quite creative, the things that different cities will do in order to establish those meaningful character pieces. And then last, you want to preserve some open space. You want some farmland, natural beauty, and critical environmental areas. So you're always looking out to protect a certain portion of the land for greater ecosystem services and aesthetic beauty and quality areas for you to hike. I'm thinking of Lime Ridge is huge for mountain bike riders. Mount Diablo and the lower hills around it are huge hiking areas. Lime Ridge is a preserved open space, so a lot of people walk that area as well. Even I'm thinking the Contra Costa Canal, that is an impermeable surface area, but it sure does help to create a sense of place and community where people can exercise and get out and enjoy the fresh air. Another idea is to provide a variety of transportation choices, and so transit-oriented development is an attempt to focus dense residential and retail development around stops for public transportation. This is crucial. I think of a city like Paris, extremely connected. You can go to a number of places because they have like 4 different train types operating in the area. And so you can just completely solely rely upon their public transportation to get to where you need to go. Sort of like BART, but that would only be one example of a service that would serve the Greater Bay Area. Strengthen and direct development towards existing communities. So you've got to reinvest in your communities going forward. You can't just build them and then leave them. And then there's this idea of infill, which is development that fills in vacant lots within existing communities. So I'm sure you've driven from time to time into cities and areas that have experienced urban blight. I'm thinking of some parts of Pittsburgh right now come to mind where there's a lot of commercial property buildings that are just completely closed down and they don't have any businesses in them any longer. So instead of building a whole nother new commercial property, why not infill and reinvest in those buildings that have already been built, possibly give them a facelift. But again, reusing those lots versus going to new areas and exploiting new land. And then there's the urban growth boundary, which is a restriction on development outside a designated area. So again, just attempts to control how far a particular city, town can develop. And then this last idea would be to make development decisions predictable, fair, and cost effective. So for example, let's build a new, low income 3-story building in downtown Clayton, but let's also put another tax on the ballot so that property owners of Clayton can contribute towards that development. It's just giving you a crude example, but a lot of residents may not feel that that's fair. And especially if you implement it quickly without any predictability. City residents may not think that it's cost effective, and especially if they have not had a voice in that particular decision. So that about wraps it up. That was, wow, almost close to 2 15-minute long presentations, but stick in there and hang tight.